Well, Dr. Kate Marvel is the author of Human Nature: 9 Ways to Feel About Our Changing Planet. Dr. Marvel, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Hi there. So excited to be here.
So excited to have you on. Been a fan of yours for a long time. Absolutely loved reading this book. But I want to take it all the way back to the start of your climate career. How did you become a climate scientist?
Whew, that's a yeah, long story. I'll start in high school. I was one of those high school kids who hated science. I would sit in physics and I would say, you know what? I don't care about this ball rolling down an inclined plane. I don't care about the coefficient of friction. And I thought science was boring. I thought it was just categorizing things. I didn't see it as kind of a creative endeavor. And then I went to college and I took a class, Introduction to Astronomy, and it blew my mind. I was like, oh my God, this is what science is for. And I fell in love with physics, with science, because I didn't know that it wasn't just balls rolling down inclined planes. It's the galaxy and it's the Big Bang and it's black holes. And so I ended up doing a PhD in theoretical cosmology, which is literally the study of everything in the universe. And when you study everything in the universe, you realize that, oh, wow, there's a lot of other stars. And all those other stars, not all of them, but most of them have other planets orbiting them. And when you look at those planets, you kind of realize that, oh, all of these other planets are complete garbage. The Earth is the only place in the universe that is good. It's the most interesting place by far. And so that's kind of how I became an Earth scientist, because I realized that this is the best place in the entire universe.
What's it like to make a career out of climate science? I feel like I talked to so many climate scientists, so many amazing people around the globe that do this work. What do you wish the average person knew about the life and a career of a climate scientist?
There's a lot of things I wish average people knew more about climate. But, one of the things that I think is underappreciated is just how fun it is. I meet people at parties and I say I'm a climate scientist and they're like, I recycle. I don't care. I good job. You should recycle. But people expect that I'm going to scold them or I'm going to preach at them or I'm going to be like a real bummer. And sometimes I am, sometimes I am a real downer, but mostly like climate science is still science. And that means it's about finding stuff out. It's about understanding things. It's fundamentally creative endeavor. And so I work with climate models, which are basically toy planets that live on a computer. And the thing about climate models is that they are so fun to play with because you can do experiments on this digital world that you could never do on the real Earth, right? If you want to understand what does the climate look like without us, you've got two options. You can ask everybody to go live on another planet for like 500 years while we do experiments on this one, or you can digitally remove all of the people, all of our emissions, all of our land use changes within a climate model. You can do other crazy stuff. You can set off a volcano in London if you feel like it. You can blot out the sun. You can make the earth spin backwards. And that's really fun, but it's also really useful because it teaches us a lot about how the earth works. And that is the knowledge base that we need when we face climate change.
You first write about working in these climate models in this chapter on wonder. And what is so interesting about what's so fascinating about your work in this book is just the full complexity of emotion that you feel in the science, in thinking about this, in writing about this, and talking about this. And I'm just curious about how do you process those emotions working in climate models?
Yeah, I mean, not very well. Some people say, "Oh, you've written a book about emotions. How should I handle my climate anxiety, or how should I handle my rage?" And the answer is very much, I don't know. I am not a mental health professional. I have no idea what I am talking about. Please do not take any advice from me about anything. But I found myself getting frustrated, and I don't know if you've encountered the same thing. With a lot of times, climate stories are presented as this is the only way to feel about this, right? You should be terrified. you should be afraid. You should be sad. You should be angry. And I feel all of those things, but I don't just feel one of those things. And so what I wanted to do is kind of embrace the, as you said, like the full complexity of being a human being living on and studying this earth that's changing. Something else that I really wanted to do is kind of address head on this notion that there is a necessary divide between science and emotion, right? For a long time, we have had this notion that, oh, scientists have to be cold and objective and neutral, and we can't feel anything because that reduces our credibility. And so I struggled with the fact that I was writing a book about emotions for a long time. And then I kind of realized, like, oh, pretending like we don't feel anything, that doesn't make us more credible. That makes us liars. And nobody's going to trust us if we are lying to them about something that is so obvious. And so that was kind of how I reconciled being a scientist and writing a book about feelings, because I wanted to kind of come out as a human almost, saying, like, yes, I am a scientist. I do physics. It's important to get the physics right. It's important to understand how the world works. And there's no conflict between that and being a human being who feels stuff.
And what's fascinating, because when I first saw the book, before I read the book, I was like, "Oh, this is going to be how compelling to go into how you feel about the climate crisis and the complexity of how you feel." And in the book, it's so compelling how you also write about science. So you're weaving both throughout the book. And I was thinking a lot about climate narratives, like you were talking about, like, and I feel like throughout a few decades, I've thought and worked on this. There is almost like a certain type of climate narrative, which is effective, and I'm not critiquing it, but it's like, you know, it's basically presenting the problem as like, it's bad, it's even worse than you thought. It's okay. There's a solution. And I thought what is so interesting is the different ways in which different people approach this kind of work. And one of the other things I found fascinating and even somewhat surprising reading this book is just what a remarkable storyteller you are and the fascination you have in storytelling. There are fake movie scripts in this book. There are all kinds of, you're leveraging Shakespeare and Greek mythology. I'm curious if, as you have moved into the role of a climate communicator in addition to a climate scientist, how you felt like the power of storytelling has been a useful tool to your profession.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I guess the answer is I don't really think of myself as a climate communicator. I think of myself as somebody who's always wanted to be a writer and was really fortunate to have the opportunity to write a book. And this is what I had to write about. This is what I do in my day job. This is the thing that I think is really important. And so I am not thinking about quote unquote climate communication through the lens of political communication or what's the most effective. Because I know what the most effective message is, and I know that we're supposed to repeat it over and over. That's how you make change. That's how you get things done politically. But that's not what I am. That's not what I'm good at. I'm really bad at following directions. I'm really bad at staying on message. And I really love reading stories. I really love hearing stories. I love telling stories. And that resonates with me. And so I kind of felt like I couldn't talk about climate change in any other way because it's kind of the overall story that's affecting everything. But what matters to us is stories, right? When we think about, oh, the earth is 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees Celsius hotter than it was before the Industrial Revolution, nobody cares about that. Nobody cares about the average temperature of the earth. What people care about is how that is going to affect their stories and the kinds of stories that are possible. Right. So, people have said, well, weather is your mood, climate is your personality. And I think that's a great way to put it. But the way that I see it is weather is the daily show, whereas climate is the theater, right? So what happens on that stage can change from day to day, but climate is the thing that is setting the parameters. Climate's the boundary conditions, the space in which every single story can happen. And because I feel like this is so hard to get your mind around, right? The fact that the entire planet is changing and that is affecting every aspect of life on the planet. And the reason it's changing comes from essentially every aspect of modern industrial life. That is overwhelming. And the way that I process it, the way that I think we all process it, is in terms of narratives, in terms of stories.
And our listeners should know before they buy this book, you've got a great sense for comedic timing and script writing, and I think maybe that's the next career, Dr. Marvel.
I have watched so many bad movies. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I will watch anything with Jason Statham in it.
That's fantastic.
It's probably pickled my brain.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the burdens that are placed on climate scientists. And I want to just like step back. I talk, as we were talking, like it. I rely so much on climate scientists. I'm so grateful for the contributions of climate scientists. I'm not a climate scientist. Talk about climate change, work on climate change, but it is the contributions of other people that make my understanding of the world possible. And for that, I am absolutely grateful. And at the same time, I realize the amount of stress and strain so many people put on climate scientists, like, including myself. Like we expect so much from people who do this work to explain to us what's happening, to explain to us what's working or what's not working, what's possible, what's not possible. And I think about the well-meaning people who put a lot of stress on climate scientists. And then I think about all of the additional external pressures that are unnecessary and harmful that happen to climate scientists. And I just want to read this part of the book. You write, quote, "Scientists are supposed to be circumspect with their emotions, to work toward a kind of detached objectivity that allows us to float above feelings, biases, and politics into a more elevated, rational plane. But I don't think we enhance our credibility by pretending we feel nothing when we are ignored or belittled or insulted. It hardly makes us more honest to lie about our emotions," unquote. And I was curious reading that and reading this book, if you feel at all like the role of the climate scientists could be evolving in 2025, or when you talk to colleagues or older colleagues, or you think back about past climate scientists, if you feel like there is a different possibility for climate scientists now.
My dream is to be irrelevant. I think that climate science is really important in describing the problem and helping figure out here are some ways that we could solve it. But the solutions, the expertise we need to implement the solutions come from, yes, engineering, but finance, like you pointed out, storytelling, politics, policy, community organizing. All of these are kind of outside my skill set. And as we kind of focus from the question, or as we move from the question, is this happening or not? Like, yes, okay, settled. It is happening. It is us. There is no doubt about that. There's still a role for us climate scientists. I think we're still important. We're still necessary. But climate change is not a scientific problem, right? It is an everything problem. It's an everybody problem. And what my dream is that when people think about climate change, they no longer go and ask a physical earth scientist like me. They ask somebody who works in energy policy. They ask somebody who is an HVAC installer. They ask somebody who's an electrician, because I think that those are the skill sets that are the most relevant. And I do, I am an optimist. That's just my temperament. And despite all of the setbacks, I do think that we are moving into a new era. We are in the midst of an energy transition. And it is an energy transition with an amazing amount of pushback, but it's a transition, I think, nonetheless. And as we move further down that path from bad stuff to better stuff. I think the people who have the skill set to implement that better stuff are not necessarily climate scientists.
Yet, again, the contributions of climate scientists remain so critical, and this is still what can draw all of our attention to what is happening. And I think about the the IPCC reports and the U.S. National Climate Assessments, which I know you've worked the lead author on the climate trends chapter in the U.S. Fifth National Climate Assessment. And I think about these big moments where where most of us focus on climate science, and it becomes a big news story, and it becomes a media focus, even if it's just for a fleeting moment. What is it like for you, regardless of whether you've done the work on the report, to see those big assessments kind of introduced in the public and then kind of come and go?
Okay, so I'm going to give you a real hot take here. I'm probably going to get canceled for this, but the IPCC is kind of divided into three working groups, right? So working group one is the physical science. Here's what climate change means. Here's what's causing it. Here's what's happening. Here's how we can attribute what's happening. Working group two is kind of the impact. So how climate change is affecting sectors like food and energy and transportation and communities all over the world. And then working group three is, okay, how do we solve this? And my hot take is abolish working group one, or at least have it come last. I think we know that climate change is happening. We know what it means. There's a lot of stuff we don't know. It's still really important to keep doing that science. But the trajectory I think that happens currently is working group one comes out. There's a whole bunch of media coverage about how climate change is happening. We're all going to die. It's all terrible. And that lasts for, a news cycle, and then it goes away. And so everybody is just left with this impression of, oh my gosh, this terrible thing is happening and we're all doomed. And then by the time working group three comes out with, actually, here's how you solve this problem, nobody's paying attention anymore. And so everybody's just sort of left with this sense of helplessness and doom, and is not paying attention to no, actually, we have most of the solutions we need to really solve this problem. And so I think at the very least, we should have the solutions coming out first. I would love to see the physical science in these assessments being used as support for what do we do about this.
That is fascinating. Something I hadn't thought a ton about. You write about things that as you mentioned, things that you know and things that we don't know, things that are certain to happen, and where there is uncertainty. And I have so much fear over things that I know will happen, and then there's uncertainty around things that could happen. One of the scariest things, I was just like living in, and I'm in the Midwest. One of the scariest things to sit in reading this book was the potential of another Dust Bowl, and just reading how you detail the science of that in the book, and you detail so many other fears you have about the climate crisis. If you don't mind, I'd love to just drill down to this one example. How is something like a second Dust Bowl not only possible, but potentially worse as the climate crisis worsens?
Yeah, so the Dust Bowl is a really great example of the incredibly complicated relationships between humans and their climate. Um, if you look at most regions on Earth, there's a pretty detectable signal in increased severity and frequency of heat waves. So heat waves are getting worse, noticeably, detectably, almost everywhere, except the central plains of the US. And the reason that we haven't really seen a big detectable shift in heat waves there is that the precedent, these 1930s heat waves, were so massive that we have not yet really seen the like since. Now, that's not very reassuring to me that, oh, all climate change is going to do is just cause a couple Dust Bowl heat waves every decade, by the middle of the century. So that in itself is not comforting, but it is interesting to sort of look back and think, okay, well, why was the Dust Bowl heat wave? Why was that such a big deal? Um, we think the Dust Bowl heat waves, and I want to say 34 and 36, don't quote me on that. There were sort of two separate, very, very, very severe heat waves in the 30s. And we think those were caused by kind of a fluke confluence of sea surface temperatures, which caused weather patterns that led to those heat waves. There's some research that actually suggests that even by the 1930s, human caused greenhouse gas emissions had actually juiced those heat waves a little bit, made them a little bit more severe than they would have been otherwise. But the reason that I think the Dust Bowl is such an interesting case in point is that we think that the Dust Bowl heat waves and the concurrent drought were made worse by human decisions. The fact that humans were living in those regions, were farming, were depleting the topsoil, that's what caused the catastrophe, right? And so that's something that I learned in the course of writing the book, is that a lot of people who work on disaster management and recovery will say there's no such thing as a natural disaster, that disasters always happen to human beings in the world that we make for it. And so, it was human decisions that kind of turned the heat wave and the drought into an absolute calamity. Now, in the 50s, we saw droughts that were almost of the same magnitude, and they did not lead to consequences as bad as the Dust Bowl because of different land management practices. And one of those components was irrigation, using groundwater to replenish the water lost to the drought. That is not a super sustainable solution because groundwater is being depleted. It's not infinite. And as the earth gets warmer, as these Dust Bowl level heat waves get more and more likely, and we can expect even more severe ones, we may not have the ability that we need to cope with them. And so, I feel like I like that you brought up the story of the Dust Bowl because it is, for me, such a useful illustration of this stuff is really complicated. But just because something is complicated doesn't mean you just say, oh, there's a lot of uncertainty, so I'm just going to assume everything will be okay, and therefore we shouldn't do anything about it.
Well, and I think about everything that the idea that everything is complicated and everything is made unnecessarily complicated by a worsening climate crisis. And I felt like reading this book and reading your writing is one of the greatest fears that you have is something that I share is in addition to the worsening impacts of the climate crisis, how are people going to react to this? What is the sociology that we understand and don't understand about the kind of pressures that people are living under, have lived under, and will live under during a climate crisis? And I'm curious, just from your standpoint, what are your fears about climate change that exist outside of climate science?
Yeah, I mean, those are the fears. Science gives us plenty to be afraid of, right? Like we know the physics of the warming earth. We know warm air holds more water vapor. And so we expect to see more intense and heavier downpours, and those will lead to floods. We know warm air is thirstier air, and so that's going to suck more moisture away from the surface and lead to more severe droughts. So that's the scary stuff that kind of falls out of the physics. But I think you're absolutely right that the scariest thing is how human beings will react to that. And if you look at history, it is so complex. People are really hard, like as a physicist, I do the easy stuff. I study things that are well behaved, right? There's equations of motion. A water droplet is always going to do the same thing in response to the same forces, but people aren't. And I suppose what I really wanted to do in this book and what really crystallized for me personally in writing it was the limits of how far physical science can take us. And the really important thing is human societies. If you look at history, there are examples of naturally induce climate change and then things going real haywire. I talk about the Little Ice Age, which was this period of cooling in Northern Europe and kind of the early modern era that we think is associated with a chain of pretty powerful volcanic eruptions that cooled the climate there. And if you look at the social trends, what you see is a real spike in the number of women who are accused of witchcraft. And if you look at the accusations, disproportionately, these accused witches are being accused of manipulating the weather, causing storms, sinking ships, killing livestock, blotting out the sun. And so I'm not saying that climate change is going to lead to more witch hunts. What I am saying is that climate change happens in the world we make for it. And it intersects with human societies, with our choices, with our current government structures, and with our history. And that is incredibly complex. And there's space, I think, for a lot of fear there.
You write about Cassandra in this book and what it's like to know so much about climate change and what it's like to sit with that information and what it's like to have all kinds of folks write to you and tell you that you're wrong or other climate scientists are wrong or this is how things actually are. If people do that to me, like I have no degree in climate science. So it's a different kind of thing. What is it like to face backlash and negative feedback doing basic climate science?
I'm a people pleaser. I want everybody to like me at all times. And I did not go into a field that kind of optimized everybody liking me. So maybe that was a poor choice on my part. It actually has gotten to the point where I'm not that bothered when hardcore climate deniers attack me. A, because there's not very many of those guys, and B, because they're not going to change their mind. I don't really care. Um, a lot of times there are people who just genuinely have questions, or genuinely are like, that seems wrong, right? Like carbon dioxide is a trace gas in the atmosphere. How can puny humans affect something as big as the planet? And I get that. I understand that because that does seem wrong, right? It just does not immediately check out. And I found that if you can engage people with curiosity, if you can find where they are coming from, what they are interested in, what their frameworks and their values are, that can, I'm not saying you magically change people's minds, but that certainly opens the door to more of a productive dialogue than just yelling at each other. I'm not a huge fan of social media. I don't think it has been a net good for discourse in general. And what breaks my heart is when I see people who are kind of on our team, on our side, the people who are concerned about climate change, just going after each other. It's like watching your parents fight. And that's the thing that really upsets me.
One of the things I want to drill down on that because one of the things that I find so heartbreaking about looking at those kind of social media exchanges that you're talking about, but also just thinking about all of the science that we have to talk about because it's really critical, but all of the science that is fascinating that we could explore. You know what I mean? And I think about that a lot as someone doing this show is how do you have productive conversations around climate science that you can't really have on social media because it's easy to it just makes social media just makes you a bad person and makes you want to fight. It's like whatever it is, but it's like in those 280 characters, it feels like anger is the dominant emotion that you have to fit in order to juice the algorithm. And what is so heartbreaking is that there are so many incredible, fascinating, uncertain conversations to have around climate science that can engage our brains and make us think about things that we don't know and what's possible to know. And I'm curious if you feel that heartbreak at all that we don't have more of these conversations. That's not as much centered in the public square as it could be.
Yeah, I think, we impoverish ourselves intellectually when we try to boil everything down to talking points. One of my kind of tiny, private, irrelevant, but meaningful to me acts of resistance lately has been just reading long, old books. It feels very subversive to pay attention to something for a long period of time that kind of can't be monetized, right? Like I don't care if Leo Tolstoy's estate or whatever gets some royalties. And I just feel like training your brain to pay attention to things and training your brain to be alive to ambiguity. For me, that's been a really useful practice, both kind of for my personal mental health and the way that I engage with the world. You don't expect to read something like War and Peace and come away having solved all of War and Peace, right? You don't expect, oh, I'm going to know everything after having read this book. But what you do hope you take away is an understanding of the basic facts of the world, right? Like there was a guy named Napoleon and he did invade Russia. But then also all of the different ways to react to that, to feel about that, all of the different choices that led to particular outcomes. And for me, kind of science is the same thing, right? Science, there are things that are just facts. There are things that are incontrovertible, right? Carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, these are greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases trap infrared radiation. They make the planet warmer. We are emitting these things, mostly through fossil fuels and cows. These things are just incontrovertible facts. And then some of the physical consequences of those are really, really well understood science. But when we look at how this earth is changing and how incredibly interconnected and intertwined everything is, then we get into complexity. And, going back to what we were talking about before about kind of talking points and boiling everything down into easily digestible sound bites, when you speak in talking points, you can't talk about uncertainty because it's going to get weaponized against you. But when you have a forum like this, when you can talk to somebody who, has done the reading and is engaged and informed and curious, then you can have these conversations and you can say, okay, here's what we know and here's what we don't know. And here's how we're going about trying to know the things that we don't know. This is kind of why I especially, and maybe scientists in general, like we can be bad messengers on climate change because we don't want to talk about the stuff that we have known for hundreds of years. We want to talk about the new stuff. We want to talk about the things that we're finding out because we live at sort of that edge of uncertainty. And that's what interests us. And that's what we want to talk about.
But also, it's not like climate scientists are like a 1990s one-hit wonder band where it's like you just want to hear the one song. Like the stuff that you're talking about is fascinating to regular people. It's just like, how do we create more space to have those conversations? Because I think like when people that I know that that are open-minded to science, don't know this, don't live in this stuff every day, but have a basic understanding of what's happening with the climate crisis. When they are introduced to new ideas or debates in science, people light up. Actually, like it lights up something in people's brains, and it is engaging. And I just think about how wonderful it would be to have space for more conversations like this. Certainly, I have the ability to help facilitate and make that happen, but I just also think how great would that be if that was more of the dominant conversation around science.
Yeah. Oh my God. I love that metaphor of the 90s one hit wonder band. I'm totally going to steal that. um, Speaking of, do you know, I'm going to totally derail this. Do you know about AHA and the EV transition?
I I have okay. This is like vaguely yes. Go ahead, but remind me, please.
Okay. Yeah, this has nothing to do with my book at all, but this is just, I'm obsessed with this. So, the Norwegian band AHA, who did that song Take On Me, they just got after they had this giant international hit, they just got really into sort of electric mobility. And they are the reason that Norway is so far ahead of the curve on EV adoption. Because back in, the 90s, AHA was pushing really, really hard for electrification. And, I think when, not if, we do kind of avoid the worst and affect the energy transition and move to a better world, I think, we're going to have to give AHA, that 90s one hit wonder band, some major credit.
I actually did not know that. That is absolutely amazing. And now I'm going to disappear into a rabbit hole after this conversation. That is absolutely incredible. You talk about there's a line from a Cormac McCarthy play, and I'm going to butcher it, and I apologize, but something like that's what an education does. It makes the world personal. And I think about that for you, the work you do and the work so many climate scientists do, is how understanding the world and the potential outcomes, the potential future outcomes, makes the world more personal to you than it ever could for someone who doesn't live in that. And I want to read another part of the book. Rewrite, quote, I've spent my entire career trying to answer the biggest questions in climate science. I've tried to understand how feedback loops operate on a complex, warming, and interconnected planet. I thought about the carbon cycle and its disruptors and when we might expect truly terrible things. Along the way, this beautiful, wonderful world has surprised me in its resilience as much as its fragility. But by far the biggest surprise has been this: I don't want to know the answers, unquote. Why is that the case?
Well, the so for example, I have done a lot of work on what's called climate sensitivity, which is this hypothetical: what if we doubled carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and then let the Earth adjust and it comes to a new temperature? What is that temperature? That's climate sensitivity. We can research that in climate models. We can try to look at kind of strains of observational evidence to try to learn what's going on. But the easiest way to measure that is to do the experiment, is to double carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and let the Earth warm up. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that experiment. And so the best outcome of my research, I think, would never be having any observational evidence of what this quantity actually is, because I don't want to keep increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
One of the area, you write about all of these squishy, interesting questions that we have to confront. And one of those things that I find interesting to talk about and to learn more about is geoengineering, both because of the possibilities and also how really, really scary this stuff is, and how at the end of the day, if we're not eliminating greenhouse gases, just what a problem that is. And I'm curious, you write about this in a chapter on pride and human pride and what we think we are capable of and where we maybe do and don't recognize our own limitations. What is it that you find potentially scary? And we could talk hours about geoengineering, but I think it's just in general, what do you find scary about the different ways in which we could approach climate solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to kind of, when we talk about geoengineering, to just sort of establish the basics, which is that no geoengineering is not an option. We have already inadvertently geoengineered the planet by raising its temperature by, almost 1.5 degrees Celsius now. You can argue about whether that is now deliberate because we know what emitting greenhouse gases do. So, but what you cannot argue is that human activities are changing the Earth's climate. We know that the climate is determined by the balance of light coming in from the sun and light escaping from the Earth. And so there's two ways that you can change the temperature of the planet. You can manipulate the light that escapes from the Earth, which is what greenhouse gases are doing, or you can block the sun that we get. And so we know that there are ways to block the sun. And we know that some of these methods would quote unquote work if to work is just to lower the global average temperature. But the Earth is a very, very complicated place. So if we decide to, for example, lower the sunlight by spraying gas and dust in the atmosphere, basically being giant artificial volcanoes that block the sun, that would lower the temperature, but it would probably have large effects on the hydrological cycle. It would make it rain in different places. It would make it rain more somewhere and rain less somewhere else. And my question is, would it even matter, right? If some country starts geoengineering, deliberately spraying particles into the stratosphere to block the sun, and then a typhoon hits China, will it matter? Will it matter whether or not you can directly attribute that to geoengineering, and with what confidence? I am not convinced it will. So my queasiness about geoengineering is, yes, rooted in the physics, but also I don't know who's going to make these decisions. I don't know that we have any international governance body, or that we could ever have any international body that is capable of making a decision for every living thing on Earth.
Whenever I have these conversations, I am so complimentary of the authors that come on this show, and I mean it every single time. Like, you get people, I might say very complimentary things. There are so many good climate change books out there. There are so many good authors writing in this space. And reading this book, I just have to tell you, there's like beauty on every single page to learn about your love of storytelling and to see it play out in this book, and the complexity of emotions and how you weave personal narrative and your feelings with the climate science. It is just amazing. And I have found in my own life, whenever I write, it either causes extreme mental anguish or trying to get the writing out, or it is a great way to process all kinds of experiences and emotions. Now, you talk about climate change and you communicate about climate change in so many different ways, but I'm curious what it's like to write about climate change. Was this experience at all cathartic?
It was, it was very almost nourishing, in the way that reading a long book is nourishing. It's just the privilege and the gift of being able to focus, of having the time to sit down and really think through something. It really helped me, I think, with my science, because I did learn a lot. I did sit down and read a lot of the literature, and I had a couple revelations where I was like, oh, that's where the state of the science is now. My personal understanding was 10 years out of date. So that was just a real gift and privilege to be able to do that. I'm not gonna lie. I do slightly prefer having written to writing. It's a nicer place to be in, and it was rough. There were some chapters that were very easy to write. The anger chapter came out very, very, very naturally, and then there were some other chapters that were a real struggle to write. I struggled with some of the more negative emotions like fear and grief, because I don't like spending time in those emotions. I think it's important to acknowledge them. I think it's important to confront them head on. But I found it hard to sort of be in that headspace for a little bit. Kind of what got me through is knowing that this is not the only part of the story.
And you write very honestly about how hard it is to strike the right tone. And I think about this in conversations I have about climate change. Like, one of the things that you uncover when you work on climate or you think about climate is how it intersects with so much of human life. There's just like nothing that isn't touched by the climate crisis. There's really like no issue that we explore that isn't in some ways impacted and informed by the climate crisis. And I feel like that the same thing can apply to human emotion. It is, we are all granted the permission to explore every human emotion through the present day crisis. And it's one of the reasons why I thought going through all of these nine different emotions, but this complex set of emotions was so valuable. Did it in any way change how you think you can process this crisis going forward?
I think so. I think, you know, encountering the stories, thinking about the stories that went in the book, even reading some stories that I couldn't fit in the book, really helped me. I think this is going to be a lifelong process for me, trying to figure out how do we process this giant, overwhelming problem. I don't think there's ever going to be an easy solution. But I did find it helpful to begin to lay out the complexity. And I think, ironically, when we talk about complexity a lot, we talk about it in order to make things glib, in order to simplify it, right? You know, we just say, oh, it's all really complicated. And that means we don't have to talk about it anymore. And obviously, it is all really complicated. And that means we should talk about it more, and we should talk about it in nuanced ways. And I mean, I guess like I'd like to make the argument that we can have nuance without sacrificing the things that are true.
I think a lot about all of the foundational science that makes all of these conversations possible, the centuries, the decades of work that allows us to arrive in this moment to have this conversation. You go back all the way to Eunice Foote, to the study of climate change and how that's evolved over time. I'm curious, doing research, writing these stories, telling these stories, what has it made you think or feel about the people that helped start this foundation that you've continued to not only build on, but help other people like myself and others understand?
I guess, just this feeling of really deep gratitude, and this appreciation for how advances in totally things fields that seem totally unrelated have led us to this present understanding. Um, I am very, I hate to get political here, but I like science. I'm very pro science. And I think one of the reasons I'm pro science and pro kind of blue skies science, pro, just getting curious about things and figuring them out, that leads us to places we never could have imagined, right? Understanding the greenhouse effect, that basically comes out of understanding quantum mechanics. And, those guys figuring out quantum mechanics back in the day never really could have anticipated, oh, this is where my work will lead, right? The person who figured out the photoelectric effect probably never anticipated the current boom in solar energy driven by our understanding of the photoelectric effect. And so, yeah, I think what I have been left with is this real appreciation and understanding of curiosity. And not just scientific curiosity, but curiosity in all forms and all fields. And I think because we are confronted with a crisis, because things do feel really scary and really urgent, we can devalue curiosity and wonder as kind of luxuries that we don't need right now. We just need to put our heads down and do the thing. And I think we do need to put our heads down and do the thing, but we can also be curious at the same time.
One of the other things that I wonder if we value highly enough is just that feeling of solidarity and connectedness. And you write about this a lot in the book. And I want to read my absolute favorite passage from the book, and then I will give you the last word here. But this is absolutely amazing. And I apologize for having to read long passages of your book back to you. But for our readers who have not yet read or for our listeners who have not yet read the book, I just want to read this quote. Quote, now there are even more people involved in the hard work of fixing the climate. Very little of what they do is immediately exciting from the outside. But every electrician who rewires a house, every accountant who helps access clean energy tax credits, and every engineer working on low carbon cement or battery efficiency is part of the army that may yet save the world. There are thousands of people approaching the problem of carbon removal with creativity, grit, humility, and full knowledge that their technologies will only work if we all do. There are people working on policy, transmission, sitting, building, planting, all of them doing their jobs and doing them well. I love these hard workers, this invisible and unsung group of planetary defenders. They may be the dullest group of superheroes ever assembled, but they are by far the most effective. I'm proud to know some of them. I'm proud to share the planet with all of them. Unquote. That is absolutely beautiful, Dr. Marvel. And I'm just curious what you were thinking of when you were writing that.
Both, the worst and the best things about climate change. The worst thing is that this is not a scientific problem. This is an everyone problem. But the best thing is that this is an everyone problem. And that means that no matter what your interests are, no matter what you're good at, you have a place in this fight. Um, I think for a long time, there's been this real debate that I think is unhelpful between do we value individual action or do we value systemic change? And none of us are individuals. We are all connected. We are connected to each other. We are connected to the natural world. We have bonds, families, communities, schools, churches, workplaces. And I think once you start thinking of yourself as an individual in a web with thousands and thousands of other individuals who you can directly affect, then you don't feel so lonely anymore. And you start to look around, like Mr. Rogers says, you look for the helpers and you find them and they're everywhere.
That is so well said and so well put, and just part of an entire book that, again, I just feel like, like they say in sports, leave it all on the field or leave it all on the court. And I just felt like you really left it all in this book. And this is such a personal and scientific and emotional guide through such a complex climate crisis. And I just absolutely loved reading the book. Again, the book is called Human Nature: 9 Ways to Feel About Our Changing Planet. Dr. Marvel, thank you so much for writing this, for all the work that you do, all the amazing work you do, how critical you are to this space. And thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about the book.
Thank you so much. It was a great conversation.